guys, recent studies have shown that passengers who fall asleep on the way to their destination feel like they get there about 15 minutes before those who stay awake. So in order to encourage that, we're going to dim the overhead cabin lights for this morning's departure. If you need additional reading lights, just look above your head, find the picture of a Harry light bulb that'll turn on your personal and individualized reading light.
Welcome to this episode of A Random Review. Now, you might notice the SNES Classic menu on screen behind me and ask yourself, what the hell are you doing? You already reviewed this. But I promise there's a reason I have it on. I'm actually going to be reviewing the NES Classic, but I'm going to cover a couple of things about the SNES Classic as well. Now, you might remember from my first episode where I talked about how the NES Classic was really hard to find. Well, Nintendo listened to everybody that wanted to get one and was complaining that the first release was way too small. And they re-released it. So this is actually the re-release. And now you can't help but see them in stores. I've seen them in Target, I've seen them in Walmart, including a bunch more SNES Classics too. They're no longer scarce. But, and this is a huge but, Nintendo has announced they are going to cancel both of these units after this holiday season. So now's the time to buy the NES Classic or the SNES Classic before they're gone from the shelves, because Nintendo seems to be wanting to focus more on its virtual streaming service on the Switch than with actual hardware that they can't update and they can't add anything to or get more money out of you from. It sucks, I know. So let's open this thing up and see what's inside. It's the NES Classic. We have the games on the back, some instruction stuff on the side in different languages. Well, let's just go ahead and break this thing open and see what's inside. First thing you're going to notice is this bag with manual and an instruction manual that turns into a poster. Now, one thing that Kurt pointed out that I didn't notice on the Super Nintendo instructions, because I didn't really look, is it tells you to unconnect the plug from the unit or it'll mess it up. It's a little odd, but okay. You're gonna have to forgive me here, because while I was editing I realized that half the footage of me unboxing was off the screen, so whatever. Anyway, let's look inside. This, of course, is the unit. There's a power and reset button, little flap that doesn't actually do anything because it's just cosmetic. Controller 1 and 2 ports, and they use the Wii style controller port so that you can actually use the 8-bit controllers. Now, believe it or not, even though this is for SNES, it still works on the NES Classic. Looking on the back, we have HDMI out and the USB power in. The system comes with only one controller as opposed to two controllers that the Super Nintendo came with. Now, one thing you will notice, and this was the complaint when it was first released, is this cord is extremely short. And while the SNES controller's cable is longer, it's not by much. Now compare that to the bootleg controller cable, and it's twice as long as both of them. Well, here's a bonus for you. One of these is the NES Classic, and the other is a bootleg. Can you tell the difference just by looking at them? Well, have you figured it out yet? If you said this one on the right is the bootleg, you were correct. As you can tell, The angles are a little bit different. Colorization is a little bit off. But the bootleg just says Entertainment System, whereas the Nintendo has its actual logo. Another difference is the power button and reset button. They've switched them and put the labels underneath the buttons instead of on them. Now the controller ports are also different. This one has labeled 1 and 2, and it's the Wii controller style, whereas this one's not labeled, and it's a style reminiscent of Sega Genesis or Atari. Looking at the back, the real one has an HDMI out, and the bootleg has just an AV out. That's the biggest difference of the back, for sure. Now, both of them have a USB plug, but the one on the bootleg is an older style USB. And then, of course, if you look at the bottom, the Nintendo has all this copyright and everything that they need to have on there, and the bootleg is just empty, with nothing. Now, what about the controllers? Well, like we pointed out before, the real one is really short cabled and has the Wii style connector, whereas the bootleg has a cable that's a little bit longer, which is the only bonus this thing can really get. But the connector, again, is a Atari or Sega Genesis style. But don't try to put those type of controllers into the bootleg because it will not work. Trust me, I tried. The front of the controllers look pretty much the same. Only difference is Nintendo has their name on theirs and the bootleg has nothing. Button layout's the same. But if you notice, if you can hear that, there's a more clicky feel to the bootleg. And it's definitely a lot stiffer when you play a game. You'll remember from the SNES Classic review, I mentioned the AtGames Sega Genesis flashback as an option to play old games. And I also said that one of the bonuses it had was the fact that it'll play cartridges. I've changed my mind on this thing. I do not recommend trying to buy it. In fact, I don't even know if they sell it anymore in stores. I haven't seen it in a long time. But there's more than just that. Number one, it doesn't play every single Genesis game. Sometimes it doesn't even play a different edition of the same game. For example, NBA Jam works fine, but NBA Jam Tournament Edition doesn't. Another thing is I went ahead and hacked into it and added some ROMs on my own to see if it was just those cartridges that didn't work or if it was the system itself. And yes, I can guarantee it's the system itself. And as a kicker, AtGames as a company has really shown their true colors recently. They came out with some kind of arcade flashback, and it wasn't what they advertised. In fact, they brought YouTubers in to the controversy and made them look bad. For example, guy that goes by the name of the immortal John Hancock did a review. They gave him a unit and he played it and it seemed to work fine using arcade ROMs and everything. But when it was finally released to the public, especially the one that was released in Walmart, those ROMs were NES ROMs, which were nowhere near as good as the actual arcade games. Some of you might not know the difference of that, but I'm not going to go into that here. So as a result, I would say avoid anything that AtGames puts out. They are a shady company. They try to come up with some stupid excuses and stuff to try to justify why it was even advertised wrong, but it's not even corrected on the box. It doesn't tell you which one you're getting. It doesn't tell you the one if it's the arcade ROMs or the NES ROMs. And to top it all off, Sega's planning on coming out with a mini console of their own. Now, the funny thing about that is AtGames jumped on it and said, yeah, we're bringing it to you. But Genesis was like, or Sega was like, no. And they had to delete their tweet.
So there you have it. I don't recommend this. I don't recommend this. And I definitely don't recommend this.
And since I'm talking about the mini consoles other than the NES, There's the PlayStation Classic. Now, I don't plan on buying this thing anytime soon. For starters, I never really got into PlayStation. I never owned one, and I've never really gotten to like it. I hate the controller, personally. I just never got used to them to try to play them, so it's not for me. But what I'm seeing from a lot of people that are fans of the PlayStation, that's another mini console to avoid. They don't have great games on it. The controller they released was a version of the first controller, so it doesn't have the joysticks on it. And some of the games that are on the system work better with those joysticks. So I don't know what Sony was thinking. So yeah, that's going to be another avoid right now.
We deserve better, consumers deserve better, and that's that.
Now let's go ahead and turn this thing on.
That's what she said.
Oh, no, not that. Just come on.
Now, like I said before, I'm actually going to use my SNES 8-bit Do controller because it actually works with the NES Classic. Now let's take a look at the games. First we have Balloon Fight, then Bubble Bobble, the first Castlevania game, Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., Double Dragon 2, The Revenge, Dr. Mario, Excite Bike, Final Fantasy, Galaga, Ghosts and Goblins, Gradius, Ice Climber, Kid Icarus, Kirby's Adventure, the original Mario Brothers game, which is based off of the arcade, Mega Man 2, Metroid, Ninja Gaiden, or is it Ninja Gaiden? Pacman, Punch-Out. Now obviously, this isn't Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. And that's because it's a re-release that they put out when they didn't renew their contract with Mike Tyson to keep using his likeness. Around this time, Mike Tyson was going through some controversies, which would have been a bad PR move on them to keep using his likeness. So instead, they dropped him from the game and changed the boss to a guy named Mr. Dream, which as far as I know is played exactly the same as you would with Mike Tyson, but I've never gotten to him, so I can't say for sure. If you want to know more about it though, there is actually a really good and interesting documentary video that the Gaming Historian recently put out, which I'll link to in the description, that goes into the whole entire history of Punch-Out, including the fact that this started out as an arcade game first, which I had no idea about. So I do recommend you check it out. Let's get back to the games though. Next we have Startropics, Contra Super C, which I don't believe I ever played when I actually had my Nintendo. I think I played regular Contra, so... Then we have Super Mario Brothers. Now, not only is Super Mario the game that revolutionized platform gaming, it's also the one that you could probably say saved home video games in the US. I'm not so sure about Europe and stuff. I think they still had them, but if you know anything about the Atari crash, you'll know what I'm talking about. Then we got Super Mario Brothers 2. Now, depending on who you listen to, some people don't consider this a true Super Mario Bros. Game. The reason for that is because Nintendo of Japan had already released a different game under the title Super Mario Bros. 2. That was a more direct sequel to the first game. In fact, it used the same sprites and game engine, only they amped up the difficulty level. But when Nintendo of America got their hands on it to test it, they said there's no way that an American audience would be able to do this because it's way too hard. So instead, Nintendo of Japan repurposed a different game called Doki Doki Panic into this. Now, another gaming historian video that I recommend is the history of Super Mario Bros. 2 that goes into more depth about it. One of the things I learned in that video is that the guy who designed this version of Super Mario Bros. 2 had actually come up with his design to be a Super Mario Bros. Game, but it got used as Doki Doki Panic first. So when they were looking for something else to call Super Mario Bros. 2, this was a natural choice. And on top of that, they have a lot of stuff that's in this version of the game that you will see even to today, like Shy Guys and a couple other enemies from this game and some other stuff, like the fact that Luigi jumps higher. That's really more from this game than it was in any other game before it. So I consider it a true Super Mario Brothers game, but that's just my opinion. Go check out his video, which again, I'll put a link in the description, and you can see for yourself. Then, of course, we have Super Mario Bros. 3, which really pushed the Nintendo platform to its limits and was a great sequel to Super Mario Bros. And it returned it to the same type of gameplay that people were used to from the first game. So that's why a lot of people just skip over 2 and go to 3. Then we got Tecmo Bowl, but from what I've been told, they took out all the players' names, so they're just generic names, because they didn't have that license anymore. And then we have The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Again, a lot of people don't consider this to be a sequel to the first Zelda game. And it's just because the gameplay is so different, but you gotta think back to way back then. They were trying to do something different and new, not just keep repeating the same thing over and over. So I, again, consider this to be a real game. Now that we've looked at the games, let's look at the settings. Now, one complaint that I already have about the NES Classic versus the SNES Classic is this setting system doesn't seem to do anything. I've got all of this stuff turned off. The demo, the auto shutdown, and the screen in-burn reduction. It should not be doing anything on the menu. As you probably noticed in the opening, I had the SNES in, and it didn't go to any other screens. It stayed on the menu. But I've already been sitting on this, and it goes into the demo, into the screen burn thing. And that's annoying because I don't want these shots to look inconsistent, but I'm sure there's going to be some that do. Anyway, those are the only settings for the console. Now let's look at display. Again, just like with the SNES Classic, they have the standard 4:3, the CRT filter, and the Pixel Perfect. Pixel Perfect makes them all perfect squares, and it really, I don't care for it because it seems to kind of just squish the screen. I like the standard 4:3 because that's what I was used to playing on, and the CRT filters just, to me, is a gimmick. I'm not a fan. But if you like it, go ahead and obviously do it. Of course, they've got language, they've got legal notices, and of course, they tell you how to get to the manuals for the games with this barcode, or QR code. Now, one thing that I wanted to do a follow-up video about the SNES Classic, but I'll go ahead and do it here because it works the same way, that I've encountered questions on is how to save games. Because yes, it'll work like the actual game because it's the ROM, but apparently some people are having trouble with their games staying saved. And I think that's because they don't realize that this actually has save states. What's a save state, you ask? That's just a way for the console itself to save the game versus the game saving it. So let me go into Link and I'll show you something. Now, I'll start a game, and it does save it to the thing, but if you really want to save it, make sure you don't lose it. On the console, and it's the same on the SNES, hit reset. You'll see down at the bottom of the screen a little image of the game floating by. Hit down on the D-pad, and then you hit A to save it. Now you have a suspend point that you can actually go back to and start where you left off, which is nice on top of the regular save because you can start it wherever you want. So if you get to a difficult part that you don't want to have to keep dying and come back and retry the rest of the level to get to, you can save it there. Now, I did use this feature in the SNES Classic review, but I didn't really explain what I was doing. So I wanted to make sure to redo it and explain it better so that you at home will know once you get this and it's easier for you. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for watching. And double thank you to those of you who have stuck around and subscribed to me, because I know I don't put stuff out on a regular basis. I really wish I could, but unfortunately I've got a full-time job. I'm planning to move to California by March, and other real-life stuff that just keeps getting in the way prevents me from focusing on just this. So, and to the rest of you, you know how YouTube works. I'm not going to remind you. Have a good day.